Welcome to CIHT Podcasts.
Thanks for joining us. I'm Justin Ward, and today I'm with Nick Tyler, Chadwick Professor of Civil Engineering at UCL. As a thinker and researcher, Nick spans across a range of disciplines in considering people and their interactions with the environment. Imagination is important for engineering, and engineering should serve people to make the world a better place. The 20th century philosopher John Rawls' big idea is a just society is one that is fair for each and every person. Rawls says, imagine. Imagine that you are setting up a society that is best for you, but you don't know who you are. You could be anyone, man, woman, young, old. Now, what type of society would you want? Nick, how do you see this thought experiment apply to decisions we make about transport?
Well, John Rawls is a very, very interesting guy, economist, political philosopher, and one of his important concepts that he raised was the thought experiment that you described, which he called the veil of ignorance, that you take a decision, and the way to view it is you take a decision from a sort of behind a veil where you know nothing, and therefore what is the best decision morally for you to take, irrespective of any of the sort of constraints of who you are and so on. And what that does is it causes you to think about that decision as a very strong moral issue, so that because you don't know who you are taking the decision, you don't know which things will benefit you having taken the decision. So you are completely neutral, and that was his point. In transport, we are usually trying to take decisions to benefit one side or part of society over another, and therefore we are not arriving at a decision from behind a veil of ignorance. We have a purpose of trying to improve something for somebody, and the question is, how do we actually know that that is actually the right thing to do? And the normal ways we do it, through economic analysis and socioeconomic analysis and benefit cost ratios and things, is the way that we currently do that, but it doesn't really get at this moral problem. So he looked at a concept which he called the difference principle, where he compared two groups that function after a decision is taken. One group, let's say he was talking about wealth, so one group you might decide to pay them more money. That's part of your decision. So you pay this, so their expectation of benefits from being paid more money goes up, and that's great. So the question that Rawls was posing is, what happens to the other group who are worse off? And initially they do quite well, because the payment of extra money to the first group means that the first group might, for example, employ the second group. But that soon fades away, and what happens is that continually increasing the amount of money to the first group means that there is actually less resource to pay the second group, and therefore the second group starts to lose benefits. And what Rawls was saying is that there is a point at which your decision must stop increasing paying the additional benefits to the first group, at the point at which the second group is starting to reduce its benefit. And therefore that gives you a sort of limit as to how much you do. Now, he was talking about wealth. We're talking about transport. So where does this rather abstract idea hit transport? I think the easiest example for me is the case where we take a road which has a lot of intersections in it. So we could decide to increase the expectation of benefits to the group of car drivers, let's say, who are going along this road. And they are upset by congestion at all the junctions. So we can close a junction. And then our group of car drivers is very happy. They can go much faster, and we can close another junction and they're even happier, close another junction and they're even happier. So one can carry on doing that and they will become increasingly happy, except that the people who want to cross the road now are finding it increasingly difficult. Every junction closure is going to make it a bit more difficult for them to cross the road. So their expectation of benefits from this decision actually is starting to get worse. So really what Rawls would be saying is, well, there is a point at which you should stop closing your junctions in order to increase the expectation of benefits to your car drivers, because the expectation of benefits to the pedestrians crossing the road is now dropping, and you therefore need to manage that. And then as a transport engineer, you can then think, if that happens at, let's say, 3 junction closures as a random number, which 3 junctions would you close? It's a transport engineering problem. But now it's a transport engineering problem within a moral framework. And that's kind of how you would apply rules to transport.
Very interesting. And you set up the accessibility research group within the Centre for Transport Studies. Can you outline what this does?
Yes, kind of does what it says on the tin. It researches accessibility. We have about 20 people in it, and we do all sorts of things. So the question is, big question, what do we mean by accessibility? And traditionally, I guess accessibility in transport modelling terms is about how many places can I get to. Accessibility, when we started the group 15 years ago, was more around the area of accessibility for disabled people. I think now we're taking a slightly more, what I would call more mature view of this, which is actually sort of trying to join the two together, because accessibility about the number of places you go is important, but it's actually only viably accessible if people with disabilities can actually also do that, because otherwise we are cutting them out from their societal opportunities, and therefore we're restricting their well-being. So there is a limit to what we mean by accessibility. And actually, I think taking that more global view of what we mean by accessibility is important. It means that we're not only focused on disabled people, we're focused on everybody. And the role of, or the piece that people with different capabilities bring to that research is that they enable us to examine the boundaries of what is possible. So how does somebody with poor vision help us to design a place better for people with good vision? That is going to be a benefit out of making it better for people with poor vision. And so how do we actually do that? That's the sort of stuff that we research.
And it's a bit about the interaction between planning and transport, isn't it?
Yeah.
The interface, and also placemaking as well. So
Indeed. I mean, it's kind of interesting. Paris always intrigues me, because in Paris there are many bread shops in Paris. Okay, it's the thing that always strikes me there. And why are there many bread shops in Paris? And the answer to that is that bread is regulated in France, so it can only cost €1, so it's fairly cheap, and also that it cannot have preservative. So the bread goes on the shelf and it doesn't last very long. And as part of the sort of French diet, bread is very important. So people have to buy bread a lot, but not once a week. They buy it every few hours. And therefore, you have a large number of bread shops in Paris. And one of the outcomes of that is you tend to walk to the bread shop. So it's quite interesting that your sort of policy on the taxation of bread, or the price control of bread, and possibly even more perversely, what you put in the bread, actually somehow is saying this is a pedestrian thing as opposed to a car thing.
Yeah.
And we could only really have out of town supermarkets if you have cars. It doesn't really work. It certainly doesn't work for pedestrians, and it's difficult to make it work for public transport, as we have discovered. So actually how you decide your planning decisions can actually be driven, and I would argue we can use these characteristics to inform our planning decisions in order to get a healthier society which is better at delivering well-being by increasing the amount of walking and activity that we do.
And one challenge we have with that is an ageing society and people with mobility impairments, people that cannot walk for long distances without assistance of some form. Are you addressing that at UCL?
Well, how we are looking at that is, I think the first thing I'd say is ageing and disabilities don't necessarily go hand in hand. I mean, I think there is a sort of general sense as people get older, functions decline. And I'm not so sure we should think like that. I think as we become older, some functions decline. So maybe I can't run as fast as I used to, for example. But on the other hand, as you get older, you are actually every day you're gaining another day's worth of life experience, and you figure out how to do something. So the fact that I can't run as fast as I did maybe 20 years ago means that the same thing that has made me unable to run so fast has also brought me more life experience about whether I need to run that fast and how do I organise stuff so that I don't need to, and so on. So actually I'm not so sure that we should think of the sort of ageing population as something which is sort of gradually getting worse. And you do hear terrible things, it's a burden on society and all this sort of stuff. I really do not believe that's true. I think that these are people who are changing in the same way that a baby changes into a toddler, changes into an adolescent, changes into an adult, changes into an older person. These are just changes. And actually we should be designing society to accommodate those changes and not penalise them. So our approach really is to say, so I have somebody who walks at a certain speed. Well, that means I have to think about, where does society play with that? How long do we give them in order to cross the road? How often do we put somewhere for them to rest in the course of walking along a space? We don't have to have a formula for that, but actually, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a formal chair. It could just be something you can lean on. It could be all sorts of things. Let's think about how people, what they need in the urban environment in order to conduct their life in a sociable way, and let's put it there. I don't see that as a big problem. So coupled with that, what often happens as people get older, because of various health issues, some of the capabilities that decline do actually mean that we can we have an opportunity to be able to arrest the decline in some way, or that we need to cope with it. So, for example, somebody becomes less able to walk. At some point or other, we can give them a stick that will help them walk. The stick comes with its own problems. So that we need to be able to design for. Because if we don't design for somebody to be able to walk with a cane, then there is a problem, because they will not be able to go and buy their bread. And therefore they eventually they don't go out of the house, and therefore they become depressed, and therefore they become a very different set of problems, which society might even find even harder to deal with. So it's much easier to design for the stick. So I think there's a question in here about actually being realistic about not seeing all this as decline, which is how a lot of people see it, but to see it as change. And what we have to do is accommodate change, and that's the way it goes. And I think that extends to, obviously, vision, hearing, touch, balance, all of those senses that we don't think about, and also, of course, cognitive capabilities. So I'm very interested in a town in Japan where they're trying to design this town to be good for people with dementia. Not because they want the entire town to be filled with people with dementia, but because they know that some of the population have dementia. And why should those population all have to be locked away because we don't know how to cope with them? Why not design the town in such a way that they can be coped with? And a large element of that is teaching people in the town how to understand and approach people with dementia. This is not only the physical thing. And they have been doing that for, 15 plus years. The result is that people with dementia are quite happily moving around the town. And suddenly you have a town which is civilised, and it can cater for a much wider part of its population. And isn't that actually what our responsibility... we are talking about transport engineering, but actually that's the responsibility of all our transport engineering, is to make that possible for the whole of society to use our systems and not to exclude them.
And on the subject of change, the environment is changing in terms of people moving to cities. We're seeing rapid expansion of cities in the global south as a particular case in point. And you've been involved in some of the work looking at developments of cities and peri-urban living as well, which is, I think, the hinterland between urban and rural areas. So what are some of the projects that you're involved in, and what are some of the lessons perhaps the UK could take from them?
Yes, well, cities, I think the first lesson that I've learnt from doing this is that the city isn't a set of buildings and infrastructure and stuff like that. The first lesson I learned is cities are people. And what we build around the people is infrastructure and buildings and things like that. And the infrastructure is about how we support society, because society, in a sense, is a collection of people. So the infrastructure, so how do I enable people to live their lives in a good way which enables them to improve the quality of their life in this environment? And the answer is, well, they need drinking water. So we need infrastructure to bring them drinking water. They need to be able to do activities. They need to be able to operate and to do things like go to work or go to school or go to college or whatever. So how do you do that? Well, you all need a transport system to do that. So how do we make sure that we make the transport system able to cope with everybody who needs to do that? Because if we don't, it's exclusive, and we can't have that for society. So that sets off. So the whole issue of the design of a city starts from the people as a principle, and therefore what you need to do in order to support the people is what transport, highway, civil engineers do. That's the job.
And sometimes the solutions can radically transform society for the better. Medellin in Colombia is one example. I understand you were involved in a project there, and that seemed to achieve some things that I think were probably unimaginable at one point in the history of the country. So could you outline?
Well, Medellin in Colombia is famous for a lot of people of a certain age as being the sort of murder capital of the world, with big, heavy problems with drug and criminality and so on. And there came a point where they realised they actually had to do something about this, and so they set out to change that. And one of the first things they did was to, in a sense, get the people in the city to love the city. And to do that, they tried to find ways of encouraging people to have a sort of mutual respect for each other. And remember, if you have a city of a million-ish people and there's 15,000 murders in a single year, the chances of you being shot as you walk down the street actually are pretty high, relatively speaking. Even if by accident. I mean, not everyone was deliberately shot. A lot of them were killed because they were in the middle of something else. And well, that means you've got to get the people to have confidence that the other person in the street isn't going to shoot them. And that is something which is really important. And so they concentrated first on how do I get the people to be able to feel that they can walk along the street without fear. And that was a massive, massive improvement on the previous situation. And then you could start doing the other things. Let's put the activities, let's get the economy going, let's give them employment, let's make sure that it's working. Let's design the city in a way that is more sort of conducive to better quality of life. And one of the things that they realised was how they'd got themselves into that position was that the city as an organisation, the municipality, if you like, of the city, had sort of vacated some of the poorer, more difficult areas. And they'd left a sort of governance vacuum in there. And the drug traffickers moved into those areas and provided a governance, not necessarily the sort of governance that one would want, but it was a governance. They maintained who went out when everybody had to be indoors while they were doing their deals, all that sort of stuff. That was all controlled by the drug trafficking people. And so when they managed to extract the drug trafficking people from these areas, they realised they had to do something about that. So they realised that actually the problem was that the people felt they had been ignored by the city. So they started to embrace the people in the process of planning what those areas were going to look like. And they created a concept which they called integrated urban projects, which are essentially how the municipality and the community come together to decide what to do and then how you do it. So very often the community would be employed to do some progressive piece of work. But the key point was that participation. And it's very, very striking now, 30 odd years later, the sort of planning department of the municipality spends 4 days a week on the street in bright red coats so that they are completely visible to the community, and the community comes and talks to them, and they have the ongoing conversations in the street. It's kind of hard to believe somebody in the UK, a planning officer in the UK, sort of putting a big coat that says, "I am a planning officer in your community," and here I am on the street for most of the time. We've sort of made ourselves more remote than that. But what they found with this is that you can do all sorts of things if you have that relationship, and the whole thing bends on that relationship between people, and you get having conversation with what sort of public transport you're going to put there becomes not an imposition of something, but actually a discussion around, and suddenly the community comes up with a different sort of idea, and being receptive because you understand the community, what that idea is, and can we implement it. That gives the community a sense of ownership over it, and then of course the whole thing becomes much easier. And not every decision goes the way that everybody wants, but if they understand, and you have that cohesion and that discussion and that participation as a sort of basic form of like everyday conversation, it's not unusual for them to meet the planning officer. So that conversation is going on the whole time. Then the tricky things are understood, and so you can do it, and it works. And that 30 years on is why Medellin is now a city which is winning prizes for being innovative, as being open, as being civilized, as all these sorts of things are coming. It's taken 30 years. Actually, in the life of a city, that is tiny. It's a really, really short time to get that sort of change. From the murder capital of the world to this a prize-winning, civilized, innovative city in one generation is a massive change.
And one other shift that's happening in another country, in China, is that you could think at one point coal-fired power stations, but now they're really pushing forward with low-carbon technology, and solar is a big development in China recently. What are you involved with work in China?
Yes, we do. We have a project at the moment looking at energy use by people in China. China is a very intriguing country to work in because it's extremely top down, and so almost it's the opposite of a lot of other countries which are increasingly bottom up. So Medellin, for example, is huge community discussion. China, less so, I would say, by quite a long way. So we're looking at a project in China where we're trying to get people to feel more responsible for the energy they use. So sort of how much energy do you use in your flat, and how much energy do you use driving to work? And let's see if we can actually try and devise a way in which you can reduce your personal energy usage, and to get people to start to think of it as a personal thing. It's tricky in China because many of the apartment blocks will be centrally heated from a district heating system, and the temperature is controlled by somebody in the office. And that's it. And if it gets too hot, you open the window.
This is sort of an illustration of the central control of the country.
Absolutely. And in a way, so there's a whole cultural piece that we need to address. And I guess the lesson I draw when I look at those two situations is, in Medellin, they realised we have to deal with the people, the culture. And in China, if you try to impose a technical solution, it won't work. You have to address the people. And that's, I think, going to be a tough lesson for Chinese cities to learn, because it's sort of not kind of how they're used to working. But I think even in a very top-down society where everybody expects the government to say what's going to happen, even if they complain about it, it's a very hard transition to make into something where people have to do that. We experienced that in Cuba. We're doing some work in Cuba, and Cuba is going through a very interesting phase at the moment. And one of the aspects of that phase is exactly that. They have been used for many decades to a very top-down government control. The government decides everything. And now they're realising this is not such a good idea, and they're trying to encourage. But you have this sort of interesting thing. We work with a community. The community says, urban design of our local street, that's the government has to tell us what to do about that. And the government is trying to learn to get the community to say it, but they're sort of a bit unsure. So there's a sort of interesting educational piece of getting both sides to kind of admit that there is a sort of role for the other, and what that role is and what that relationship is. And there's a lot of unsticking of professional pride, sense of ownership, and the expectation that that professional person does make these decisions and things like that. So it's a sort of interesting piece at the moment where we're working with the community and the government to try and figure out how they can make that change. And that's a really interesting one to watch, because I think we can learn, for the UK, we can learn a vast amount from that sort of experience. We don't have that heaviness that was there, but actually I reckon if you went to a lot of planning offices around the country, you would find a willingness for the planning officers to go and talk to the public, but they're not quite sure how to do it. And the public sort of kind of expecting the planning officers to do terrible things, and therefore not really knowing how to talk to them, because the only dialogue they have is sort of complaining at each other. And what we're having to learn in Cuba, and I think we'll learn in China, and has been learnt in Medellin, is you get the dialogue going. And the dialogue means that you can actually make an awful lot of other things much easier. So I think it's very interesting to pick these things up from our work around the world and bring it home to the UK, because I think we can actually gain a lot from that sort of work.
And you were the founder of PAMELA. Can you describe what that is and explain problems it sought to address?
Well, I should say that PAMELA is a laboratory. So PAMELA stands for Pedestrian Accessibility Movement Environment Laboratory. And it's a laboratory designed to enable us to explore how people interact with the environment, and it enables us to create environments at one-to-one scale. So in the laboratory, for example, we have a configurable floor, so it looks like a footway really, because that's kind of what it is. But we can bend it, so we can put slopes in it, and we can make holes in it, and we can raise it and lower it and have steps and things like that. We can change the surface, so you can have different sorts of surface. Then we can build structures onto that. In the past, we have built structures like trains, so we did a lot of work on testing trains for the Thameslink programme. We're currently involved in building and looking at the design for a new tube for London. So to do that, we build a mock-up tube carriage, life scale, and we bring a couple of hundred people in there, and with different boarding and lighting configurations as we set it. We then test different detailed design aspects of the train. How wide are the doors? Where are the seats? What do the seats look like? What do the poles look like? How does all that affect people getting on and off the train? What's the difference between the train floor and the platform? What happens if we put platform edge doors on? All that sort of stuff. So very real people doing stuff at real size. We can control the noise. So in those train experiments, for example, you will hear the train come into the station, you will hear the doors open, you'll hear all the announcements, you hear all the noise of all the people around there, and people very quickly forget that they're in a shed with a wooden mock-up of a train. It looks pretty much like a tube train. It's all coloured and shaped and so on like a tube train, but obviously it's a train standing still. But we can convince them that it isn't, and then that works. And then we can alter the lighting, so we can control the lighting. We can see what a street design will look like in sunny day in the daytime and under different kinds of light at night. So do you lose information? Do you lose accessible information, for example, by the street lighting, things like that? And we can combine all that sort of stuff and do things. And we work a lot with sensorial stuff, so we're doing a lot of work with hearing people, hearing researchers. So for them, we built a pizza restaurant, for example. So they wanted to know what it felt like to be in a pizza restaurant. So we created a pizza restaurant, including pizzas for them. Another one we had was how the handling of wheelchairs and occupants onto aircraft. So we built part of a Boeing 777 aircraft and the jetway from the airport, and we loaded wheelchairs on using the wheelchairs used by the airlines, which are fairly horrendous, if not extremely horrendous. But to see what actually was involved and why was it such a tricky thing to do, and so that we could get a better understanding of maybe there's a better way of designing that sort of wheelchair to make it more comfortable for the people in it, but also for the person who's actually doing the manhandling, because that's a tricky job. So we can do all that sort of stuff.
A whole range of environments where people interact with.
Yeah, life size. The key is life size.
Yeah. I like the message. Probably a good point to end on is making the world a better place, and that's what people in the transport sector are ultimately charged with doing. So thank you, Nick. You've been listening to a podcast with Nick Tyler, Chadwick Professor of Civil Engineering at UCL. So thank you for listening.
Thanks very much.